Well, hey, welcome and thank you for joining me, folks. My name is Ryan Murphy, and this is my new attempt at sort of a podcast, a sort of Disney themed podcast. Anyone who knows me knows I am a major Disney file. So, this is my attempt at sort of starting something new, and I thought I'd coincide it with what better, the 100th anniversary of Disney this October. So, Disney is turning 100, and that sort of got me thinking about, what is a Disney file? Why do people like myself kind of identify with Disney adult or DisNerd or Disney file or whatever, all these terms you can throw around. Um, because no one says that about like Paramount. No one's like, I'm such a big Paramount fan, like Paramount, but obviously Disney owns lots of things that they don't really put their label on that don't necessarily fit into that mold. Name your franchise, anything 20th Century Fox, of course. Um, but what they do put their label on tends to fit into a certain mold. And I wanted to kind of explore what that was and who better to reach out to and talk to than a friend of mine who's a big Disney nerd himself, has directed two motion pictures for Disney. And that's my friend Steve Anderson. Steve, thanks for joining me as my first guest.
Hey Ryan, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. Very excited to talk about all this.
Yeah. So, yeah, let's dive right into it. For me, first thing we got to get out of the way, kind of elephant in the room. Disney is made for kids. It's family friendly entertainment.
Right.
That's sort of and with that comes a certain sort of whimsicalness, things that kids like, which is bright, colorful characters, imaginative characters. Like one thing I always say is like Cars. The movie Cars could just be about a racer. You could just made that movie through Paramount and made it about a racer who has to get back to the race. But you make
Yeah.
the characters cars, and that's what sort of makes it a lot more Disney-ish. Is that the characters are just these bright, colorful, imaginative figures, no matter even if they're going through the same things that humans could be going through. So bright, imaginative characters, whimsical, happy endings. Even if there's a lot of crap that happens before the happy ending, there's usually a happy ending. Those are sort of my thoughts. What were some of yours?
Yeah. Well, kind of going off of that, I mean, I think to your point, Disney films have a real relatability to them. I think the best ones are ones that everybody, regardless of gender and culture and any of those things that we use to kind of define ourselves, that transcends those things. I mean, that was really something Walt Disney was adamant about early on, is when doing these his early fantasy movies. And particularly I remember hearing this about Bambi, and there, how we're not just doing cartoony deer and bunnies and stuff like that. We have to make them believable. We have to have humans be the audience, the humans in the audience, be able to watch these cartoon animals and be able to identify them as animals first, and then the personalities, they will relate to them as well, and it just makes it that much more satisfying to the audience. So he was such a big proponent of believability and relatability, um, in characters and stories that they did. So I think that continues to this day. I think a Disney movie is something that, yeah, you say it's for kids and for family audiences, but and there's also that you can go one step further and kind of say they should be for everybody. They should be able to be related to on all fronts. I think that's why, a lot of times the classic Disney films, Walt really drew from obviously fairy tales, Grimm's fairy tales, and those kind of things, but also kind of the tradition of the Aesop's fables with using animals as surrogates for humans. So you can tell a human story, but by moving it one step away from being literally just a story about humans, or like you said, about like with cars, you make it a car, just suddenly you make them cars, it takes on a whole different meaning. But we can all connect to it somehow. We can all find those characters and those moments that we relate to. Um, so yeah, absolutely, I totally agree with you. I think there is that relatability, but also but then having that kind of level of metaphor or level of fantasy on top of it. This sort of removes it from our world, but we can still identify a humanity that we can relate to within that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Um, one thing, just, again, like we have films that are touchstone or, now of course, uh, it's interesting with the Marvel movies and the Star Wars movies and even Avatar. Those are sort of halfway recognized as Disney. So Disney obviously, like I said, they have Touchstone. Ron Miller found a Touchstone in the 80s because actually out of a conversation he had with Walt, I'm sure you know, about To Kill a Mockingbird, the family had gone to see To Kill a Mockingbird, and Walt walked out you know, um, kind of upset that he couldn't make a film like that because it wasn't under the umbrella. And so since the foundation of Touchstone, it's kind of been, and they've made everything from Pearl Harbor to they're making Alien movie now. But it's interesting to see what they'll sort of put under the Disney umbrella and what not. Good example being The Nightmare Before Christmas, which was put under the Touchstone banner, and then because they were afraid it wasn't kid friendly, and then all kids ended up loving it. And they're like, okay, so all the prints you see now on Disney Plus and everything have the Disney logo before the
Yeah,
movie, which is not what it initially was released
yeah,
under. Movies like stuff like Marvel and Star Wars and even Avatar, they don't carry the Disney logo before the movie, but then they'll use it in sort of advertising Disney, like, so they sort of halfway recognize it. It's sort of interesting to see what gets recognized and what doesn't. What are some of your thoughts on
sure.
that? Do you feel like there's any movies that like should have been like, more exemplified as Disney, or maybe didn't fit the mold in your idea?
Hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, the first thought that pops into my head, it's an interesting point that you make because back when they created Touchstone, and then years later they had Hollywood Pictures, so they
Mhm.
could release a little more adult movies under those labels. They had such an identity problem in the post-Walt era in the 70s and then into the early 80s because Disney became so uncool. Like the word Disney started actually being a detriment to their film, so they had to find it, not for the family audience, but if they wanted to try to age anything up or aim at an older audience, the having the word Disney on it was like the kiss of death back then. So they, of course, created, like you said, created Touchstone so they could release those movies without having to say Disney on it. But now make an interesting point because there's still the brands, the Pixar, the Marvel, the Lucasfilm, all those, but they don't shy away from saying we're Disney. It's a Disney thing. They're not embarrassed to say Disney anymore. So I guess that sort of speaks to the evolution of the Disney name and how it's kind of it doesn't it's not so much of a of a curse anymore,
Mhm.
like it sort of used to be there for a while when the world was changing and Disney was kind of redefining itself. Now it's much more embraced, or like you said, you use that phrase, the Disney adult, in your introduction. That's sort of become part of pop culture too, that idea of the Disney adult. So it's interesting because now all ages seem to embrace Disney, and I don't know, you don't get a sense of that. I'm an adult and I'm going to go watch a Disney movie, but I have to sort of be closeted about it. Like I can't admit that I went to a Disney movie without a kid. That was always the like the thing nobody wanted to be caught doing back in the
Mhm.
70s or early 80s. Or like, I remember Beauty and the Beast was sort of the one that became the
Yeah.
date, adults would go on a date to see Beauty and the Beast without having kids, and that kind of started
Yeah.
that ball rolling of it's acceptable, it's okay to do that.
Which is also in the middle of the Disney Renaissance, so it's very much
Yeah,
like, like that was a time when things were changing and it was becoming more, you know, just better. Everything got better.
yeah.
Um,
Well, and I guess along the same lines of Nightmare Before Christmas, it made me think of Roger Rabbit too, because
mhm.
Roger Rabbit, obviously, it originally, most likely, I'm assuming, was going to be a Disney
Mhm.
branded movie, the early incarnation. But then as it got a little more adult, it
Mhm.
had to be Touchstone for that same reason, I think, is that they were a little bit afraid to
Mhm.
some of the more racy elements to that. But I wonder now if you just slap a Disney, if it wouldn't be bad to slap a Disney rating
Mhm.
on if you got Roger Rabbit today. I don't know. Would that be as shocking? now that
Well,
there's been.
interesting about that is, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you
Oh,
off,
go
but
ahead, go ahead.
the interesting thing about that is Pirates of the Caribbean, the first Pirates of the Caribbean movie in 2003 became the first PG-13 rated movie to carry the
Right,
Disney logo, you
right,
know?
right. Yeah, and I wonder if I don't know. I guess it again, it's really speaks to how that Disney name has evolved in the way
Mhm.
people do it, and it's not viewed as something to shy away from or to kind of poo-poo
Mhm.
or dismiss,
Yeah.
like it was for a while.
But yeah, but going back to sort of what some of the ideas behind it, even if some of their Disney stuff now, like Pirates of the Caribbean and certain other movies can be PG-13 now, even carrying the Disney label, and they sort of halfway recognize Avatar and Star Wars. Like I said, that those movies don't have the Disney logo on them when you watch them, but they're very much embraced in terms of like having Disney on the names of the merchandise, being on Disney Plus, not on Hulu, all that sort of stuff. Like people know those are Disney because there's especially Star Wars, Marvel, Avatar. There's a lot of bright, colorful characters, bright, colorful
Yeah.
stuff going on. It's fantasy, science fiction.
Mhm.
Um, but the thing that going back to sort of some of the things that you expect to see in a Disney movie, if it carries the Disney logo, even if it's a little bit more mature, um, is going back to that idea of there's usually a happy ending. I don't think there's a lot. I mean, you could say like Avengers Infinity War maybe, but there was always the promise that we're going to get a second chapter. But and the one that stands out to me always in terms of what's kind of a downer, which was very much a Disney movie produced during the Walt era, which was Old Yeller. I
Oh
think Old
yeah,
Yeller is probably the most depressing Disney movie out there.
yes.
But in general, there might be a lot of bad circumstances, but to quote Don Bluth, kids can handle anything as long as you give them a happy ending. You
Uh-huh,
know,
uh-huh. Yeah.
so
Yeah, and even if I remember Old Yeller correctly, I mean, there's this Fess Parker, the dad, gives a speech at the end after the really bad,
mhm,
spoil it for anybody who hasn't seen it, but the really negative ending, and it sort of, so they do manage to somehow kind of give it an uplifting
till
note
yeah,
at the end.
mhm,
Um, so even I mean, and I find that really interesting about a lot of the earlier films of Walt's time because he wasn't really afraid of those darker elements. I mean, sure, some of the fairy tales that he adapted, he did pull back on some of the more horrific things that happen in some of them. But I mean, particularly Snow White, Pinocchio, Fantasia, there's some pretty dark stuff in there. Uh, I mean, I think Legend of Sleepy Hollow is I mean, it's one of my favorite films just ever made. But the spookiness of that, I think, is really great. Um, uh, and yeah, and then some of there was a Darby O'Gill and the Little People, the live action movie that they made, also kind of had a banshee in it that was very spooky,
mhm,
and he wasn't he was pretty smart about saying you have to have the dark with the light. You can't
mhm,
just have all happiness and sunshine because that's boring, and it's not true. It's not the way the world is. So and it always felt controlled. It was never overbearing. um it wasn't all the way through a movie really dark or anything. It was like dark moments, and then there was
mhm.
always moments to balance it out. But um uh yeah, I feel like I got off track there somehow.
It's fine. I know you said you had some notes of your own, so if you have anything to just sort of throw in that you kind of really felt like needs to be said on the matter,
Oh
go
yeah,
for it.
well, I was sort of, you talked about what makes Disney Disney, and my brain kind of started going into themes, or like um some story tropes that are very classic Disney. Not that other movies don't do these
Mhm.
as well, but um my brain just started rolling through Disney history and kind of
I think we're going to have some of these in
categorizing
common.
some of those. What's that?
I think we're going to have some of these in common. We're probably going to have some brain twin moments here. But yeah, go
Oh
ahead.
yeah, good. Yeah. Well, I mean, off the first like really general sort of big picture, and maybe this doesn't necessarily apply to today's movies, but you know, when you think of classic Disney movies, you really think of that love conquers all idea, or it's very good versus evil. The virtuous are always rewarded, and the those without that virtue are punished. It's a very
Mhm.
black and white kind of world. It's very polarized. The good is very good and very clearly defined, and the bad is very clearly defined as well. Not a lot of gray area in that. Um,
Yeah.
uh, I was thinking too, I could, I, I'm not coming at the, I don't come at this from a really academic, like movie history standpoint. So I'm sure there are other movies prior to these films that would go into this category. But that notion of magical realism, if you've heard of that phrase, magical realism, that notion of a story that's set in our world, and our world is very believable. We understand it to be our world, but there's one thing about it that's there's a bit of magic, or there's a bit of something that's just not real, let's say. And um I feel like that was a really big, you know starting with the Shaggy Dog in the
Mhm.
in the 50s. I think Disney kind of that became a genre, if you will, that became very synonymous with Disney, because you have the Shaggy Dog, you have like Absent-Minded Professor. The Herbie movies are very much, I think, to me, those magical realism, because it's our world, even though it's heightened and sort of wacky. It's a wacky version of our world. It's still our world with all the right, um, you know, everything is what we know it to be. But then there's this car that seems to have this sentience, sentience, or as because I love the 70s movies. There's a movie called Gus, if you're familiar with this movie, about a field goal kicking mule. And this losing football team finds this mule that kicks with his back leg, and he can kick 100-yard field
Oh,
goals.
geez.
So they bring him onto his team, and they start winning. Freaky Friday obviously is also that kind of same idea, and it's totally unexplained too. That's what I think is interesting, is that something like Herbie or Freaky Friday has that magical realism idea. There's one idea that sort of is the catalyst for the story, and
Mhm.
it doesn't make any sense, and it's out of the realm of possibility for our world, and it's never explained. Just because,
Mhm.
like in the original Freaky Friday, it's just because the two happen to say, I wish we could switch places, and they switch places, and there's no explanation for it, and then they just switch back at the end because they say we're ready to switch back. um, there's something kind of cool about that. I think that became very much a Disney staple
Mhm.
for a while. I don't know how you feel about that, but
Yeah.
uh,
I think that also applies to what you said is one of your favorite films is the this Legend of Sleepy Hollow.
yeah,
Is you go the whole sort of 45-minute short of just kind of just watching this guy live his life, and then all of a sudden at the end there's a headless horseman. It's never explained. It's never, we don't really know. There's some people who think it was like all an act or something by Brom
yeah,
Bones, or yeah. So, but
might have been supernatural, might not have been supernatural. We don't know, but yeah, exactly, not explained exactly. Um, I mean, animal stories obviously I think became a real staple for Disney as well. Certainly in live action, they did so many of those. There's the True Life Adventures, of course, but then they were also,
Mhm.
especially for the Wonderful World of Disney TV show, they did a lot of stories about animals that they kind of personified the animals, and
Mhm.
through a narrator, the narrator would say, Greta was a greyhound and she wanted to go to the races.
Exactly.
They would tell a story kind of that way. But then
Mhm.
there's sort of the animals and people suits genre that
Yeah.
I think became very classic Disney. And again, that really comes from like Aesop's fables, or Uncle Remus. I know that's not a very, not to be taboo or anything, but the Uncle Remus stories with animals that are very human. They walk on two legs, they dress in clothes. You've got Robin Hood, you've got Rescuers, you've got Great Mouse Detective.
Yeah.
More contemporary, you've got Zootopia.
And that goes back into the idea of you can tell these stories, but they're just with characters that are a little bit more bright and colorful than real life. It's
Yeah,
sort of kids love animals, and but yeah. So you just make them a little bright and colorful, or make them animals instead of humans, or make them cars instead of humans, and you got
exactly.
yourself a little bit more of an attractive sort of eye candy sort of nature to it, as well.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, and maybe it makes the stories a little more kind of easy to digest because it's not
Hmm.
so literal. It's not so one to one with our world. It's not just humans to humans.
Hmm.
It's humans to yeah, a cartoon animal or a talking car or a, you know, bugs and bugs life or whatever it might be.
Hmm.
And certainly for a younger audience, that's what kids entertainment is all about, really. There's
Yeah.
always these, animal characters or Thomas the Tank Engine or any of the, and then they
Yeah.
tell stories, and it helps the kids understand them a little bit better because they're done in a much more stylized way. It's more metaphor than literal. Um,
Hmm.
so Disney definitely, I feel like that became and I love that genre. I know a lot of my colleagues uh love that, or like Mr.
Hmm.
Toad. Um,
Yeah.
Now, granted, that was based well, a lot of these were based on other
And
source
they're all, I
material.
mean, that's what Disney did best, was to adapt, stories
Yeah,
that were, very much in existence. There wasn't a whole lot of like original Disney films until like The Lion King, really. And a lot of
no,
people
you're
say
right.
that's Hamlet. I'm like, it's nonsense. It's not Hamlet. What is, whatever. It's
Right.
officially it's an original story. Yeah. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
no, you're right. It's definitely much more contemporary films where you find uh original
Mhm.
original material that would be made in,
Mhm.
like, particularly in animation, I should say, not
Yeah.
necessarily live action, but yeah, you're right. They were all adapted
Mhm.
up. Yeah, you're right. Up through, I guess to be splitting hairs, but Rescuers Down Under. It was sort of suggested by the Rescuers books, but it was kind of made up. The
Yeah.
sequels. Anyways, um, yeah, that was kind of another one. There's also the Misfit. Uh,
The Misfit. I was going to get to that. Yeah. The
yeah.
the
Okay. Go
Misfit.
go for it. You go.
Well, being sort of uncomfortable in the environment that you were born into. Well, first of all, I have to say one thing, big thing is coming of age. Coming of age,
Oh,
realizing sort of who you are is associated with youth, coming into your own skin, sort of to speak, and even Old Yeller, as depressing as it might be, is a coming of age story. But and that goes back to the youth angle, but anyone can appreciate it because everyone has had to do that. Sometimes they had to do that later in life, which is something I can relate to. But the idea of the X who wants to do Y, like one of their oldest, it was part of their the Three Caballeros was a
uh-huh.
short called The Cold-Blooded Penguin, which is about a penguin who wants to be warm. And that created that, maybe not that specific one created that mold, but it created this idea of, or it was part of this idea that exists in Disney today, that it's a guaranteed billion-dollar thing. So like the Little Mermaid is a mermaid who wants to be human. She wants to have legs. One thing I think Brad Bird just hit the nail on the head in 2007 when he came up with this brilliant idea, and probably the most Disney idea that's ever been conceived. He's like, "Hey guys, I got an idea. A rat who wants to cook gourmet. Somebody give that man a raise because that is the most Disney idea that's ever, that's that kind of thing." And then, or it
Yeah.
doesn't have to be necessarily contrary to his whole world, but like contrary to the family. The family doesn't understand them. So Coco is, you know, his family no music, and he's like, oh, but I love music, and or the family that doesn't. It's either the family that doesn't understand them, or the little town full of little people
Hmm.
that they're not fitting into. The reason they fit in is often because they are smarter or better. you know that
Right.
like they have the right idea. Like Coco's family is pretty much wrong, I would say, for shunning his musical ability, and they want to break free, and they want to become a new creature. And yeah, I think that's exactly what you were going for. And part of that is being a misfit until they feel comfortable in their own skin by the end of the.
Yeah, and I mean, to me, the classic misfit story is Dumbo, of course.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
the character who's, like you said, uncomfortable in their own skin, and they have kind of have to find their power, right? If the world tells them they're not worthy, and then at some point they have to find that power to say, my greatest, or what is perceived as my weakness is actually my greatest strength. And Dumbo has that same kind of paradigm, the original, not the remake. Um, and yeah, I suppose things like, I mean, even some way Jungle Book has a bit of the misfit angle to it. I was thinking of Tarzan, having worked on that. Uh, you know, a human boy who wants to be an ape. Um,
Mhm.
there's a great short made in the 50s called Lambert the Sheepish Lion. I don't know if you're familiar with this short. Um,
Yeah.
but the same kind of thing. A little lion cub who gets raised by a herd of sheep and basically grows up to be this massive lion, but inside he feels like he's a sheep. So
Hmm.
he has to kind of find his inner lion so he can save his family from this wolf who's attacking and gonna eat all the sheep. um the same kind of idea, that misfit
Hmm.
story, which
I think Disney did do a version of the Ugly Duckling, which
yeah,
is
yeah,
not the ultimate.
exactly.
Hmm.
And that kind of leads into that hero's journey paradigm, that thinking of things like Aladdin or Mulan, even Moana to some extent. Hercules kind of has a bit of that. The person who doesn't fit but finds that
Hmm.
they have a greater calling, or like in the case of Hercules, he has to, I'm not just an ordinary person with these freaky superpowers, I'm actually a god. And then I have
Hmm.
to kind of own that, and the diamond in the rough thing with Aladdin. I'm a street rat, I'm marginalized, I'm dismissed, and then I end up saving the day at the end.
Right.
um
And the idea of not fitting in, like certainly with the family, Mulan being, I wish I could be the perfect daughter. And then,
yeah.
20 some years later, Moana comes out and she says, I wish I could be the perfect daughter. I'm like, that sounds familiar.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
I mean, every
uh
every kid has a family that they're born into, and sometimes they don't feel, like they fit in with their family, or like they're what their family expects them to be, and so they feel misfit, whether it's their family or with
yeah.
society or whatever,
Oh, I think you
So.
hit it totally on the head, like back to that relatability thing. I mean, from a and I think that brings up a good point about, in my opinion at least, what I think works really well in Disney films is when you can come up with a concept and a theme that adults can understand and kids can understand as well. If the kids can understand it, most likely the adults will be able to understand it because they were kids once. And
Mhm.
human nature is constant. Like, one thing that never changes throughout time is human nature, and the fears we have as children, or the confusions about the world we have as children, or all those things. If you can hit on an idea that a child can relate to and an adult can relate to, and something like, yeah, feeling out of sync, like you said, with your family, with the world, with and that transcends childhood even. I mean, we continue, I think, even as adults, we continue to find ourselves in those kind of situations. And um as life progresses, you constantly find yourself in those moments where you're like, I don't fit in here. I don't understand the vibe of these people, or of this new job I just got, or whatever it might be. Yeah, so I think those misfit stories, very quintessential Disney and really relatable,
Mhm.
perfectly kind of in line with those original philosophies of Walt about finding those really human and those relatably human stories.
Mhm.
Definitely, yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
And I don't know what else you had, but one thing that I want, is good that goes with that. There's the misfit. There's sort of finding yourself, and those two often go hand in hand because you're a misfit until you find yourself, or until you find
Right.
that your self-validation, the thing that you were afraid made you a misfit, or that didn't relate to your family, then eventually your family supports you in that, or something like that. So there's that, both the idea of misfit and finding yourself, self-discovery, self actualization, but also that goes sort of going along with that is the idea of sort of dreams coming true,
Hmm.
which has to do with the wish factor. Of course, the song that was introduced in only their second feature that has now become literally the anthem of the studio is "When You Wish Upon a Star." And now that we're in the centennial year of Disney, the movie that's being released is called Wish, which is sort of harkening. I mean, it's very intentional that it's the 100th anniversary movie, that they're making this to sort of this movie, I think, is bears talking about, because it is sort of being made to be sort of it's being made having distilled Disney down. They like the people behind it have sort of made it to be the perfect Disney movie, and it's
Right.
called Wish, and it's about someone's wish coming true, and that's very has to do with Walt's sort of vision, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's nothing more like classic quintessential Disney than Jiminy Cricket singing "When You Wish Upon a Star" at the beginning of Pinocchio. Absolutely. And man, that goes through obviously through Cinderella um and probably back to that idea of the virtuous being rewarded.
Hmm.
The character that's longing for something, something better. Usually I want to, I'm a misfit, I don't fit in, I want to go find the place that I belong. Or I'm an orphan and I want to go find a family, whatever it is. um you sort of make a wish, and you are rewarded for your virtuousness,
Hmm.
uh, for the goodness that's inside of you, and the purity of your wish, right? um yeah, that's and I guess there's a lot of those movies that don't have a literal wish, but there's you know I guess that's kind of what the "I Want" song became. Once
Yeah.
Little Mermaid with "Part of Your World," and I Want Adventure in the Great Wide Somewhere. And as the Disney
Hmm.
musical kind of really kicked in the 90s, I guess that
Hmm.
sort of took the place of that literal wishing on a star, or making a
Yeah.
wish in a well, or the way Snow White does, or something. That almost feels like that's the musical version of making a wish.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, to a certain extent, you definitely say, that's all films. That's all, not all films maybe, but that's a great majority of stories is a
Yeah.
character wants something and they get it. But with Disney, it's very, like you said, it's very much like has that romantic, drop, that whatever you want to call it, the romantic arc to it, where the virtuous are rewarded, and you get your wish because well, some people would say movies like The Little Mermaid or something like that is about you disobey your parents and then you get exactly what you want. But so that's an issue some people have taken with that film and a couple others. But
Right.
but generally speaking, yeah, it's like there's good, there's evil, and then you wish upon a star, and you like Hercules. The story is that he literally has to earn his sort of
Mhm.
godhood or whatever. He has to become a hero. He has to be more than just a strong man. Yes, Pinocchio and Hercules. I never thought of those two in tandem before,
Mm.
but both of those have very similar stories. They're about boys who want to be something else, who
Yeah.
are being told that they have to earn it. They have to be courageous and virtuous to get sort of their wish. And yeah, and like you're right, Howard Ashman coined the phrase, the "I Want" song,
Mm.
and that's certainly become a staple. And I can't, yeah, like I can't wait for the new movie to have, that song's already been sort of leaked
Yeah.
online, but yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that also brings up the idea of music in general. I mean, to me, um,
Mhm.
I find not that only Disney movies use music, but at least the Disney that I grew up with, songs were so attached to Disney movies, particularly in animation. So stories with music, and not just
Mhm.
score, but with some kind of songs, to me,
Yeah.
certainly as a kid, um, I don't really remember seeing any other kind of movies that had songs in them except Disney movies. So,
Yeah.
and I remember when we were making Meet the Robinsons, um, uh, I really wanted to make sure there was original music in the film. Not We weren't making a musical, but I felt
Mhm.
very strongly that we should have songs. find the right kinds of songs and the right way to use them. And there was a time period there where the leadership of the studio was trying to do trying to put contemporary music in there and not
Yeah.
write original music. And I hated that idea. And I was so glad that we were able to undo that curse, if you will, and get original music back in there. Because to me, that's a Disney movie has to have original music in it. I mean,
Yeah.
maybe I'm being a little too. I know there are some movies that don't, some Disney movies that have existing music, but I don't know. It feels very classic Disney to have original songs in a film.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
think that the interesting thing about that is I think that came about for a very specific reason. Maybe if history had unfolded differently, or Walt had lived in a different year or something, a different time, maybe he wouldn't have been associated with music. But what happened was that he was in a position to make the first sound cartoon up to that point,
Mhm.
and so he made Steamboat Willie. And so, because it was the first sound cartoon, he wanted to really, really run with that and really make sound consequential to the story. And so he made this little musical. And who knows? Like maybe he hadn't thought about doing musical stuff before that. Maybe that was the thing that kickstarted it. I don't know. But
Yeah.
like ever since Steamboat Willie, you're absolutely right. Disney has been associated with. I mean, there wasn't technically a. Was there a song? I mean, was there lyrics in Steamboat Willie? I'm not. I don't know, but
I don't think so, but still,
yeah, still the,
yeah,
the idea of associating with music, I think that may have been the seed that germinated in Walt's mind. But you're absolutely right. Disney the songs, even like, it's funny you say that the Disney at your time was going against having original music. It was actually the opposite 10 years before that. When they were making Toy Story, they had to fight with Pixar because they wanted it to be a musical. And John Lasseter was like, no, no, no,
yeah,
no. And so they compromised and had Randy Newman songs in the show. But obviously their tune had changed by the time you were working with them. So that's kind of funny. But yeah,
yeah.
music. So yeah. So I think,
Well,
yeah, between everything we've said, I mean, I think, the idea of making something that's appealing to the whole family has to do with youth, discovering oneself, uh, which often comes from not fitting in, not being comfortable in your own skin, finding your own destiny, those sorts of things. That magical, that sort of whatever, I don't know what was the word you used, but realistic magic or
oh, yeah,
magic
magical
realism
realism.
magical realism. There's a lot of aspects, just the coming of age aspect, and of course, music. So
Yeah,
I think maybe we've distilled the perfect recipe here for. I hope, but that's the thing is that Wish is coming out. I'm gonna be there opening day. Obviously, but and I hope that this film is sort of what it's trying to be, a good representation of what it's trying to be, which is sort of the distillation of sort of the what makes a Disney movie, and
yeah,
yeah, so I hate to turn this into like a little bit of an advertisement for Wish, but go see Wish when it comes out. But if
yeah,
you wanted to add anything
absolutely.
before we go,
Yeah, I
go
mean,
for it.
I'm curious too. I'm curious to see how they sort of make it a tribute to the 100 years of Disney without making it a commercial for Disney. You know what I mean? Because clearly it's an original film, and it's not like the movie stars all the Disney characters or something. So I'm really curious and interested to see how they, because I have a feeling that there's going to be kind of Disney. I don't know if this is true or not, but my sense is that there might be some little sort of Disney Easter eggs, kind of very,
Hmm.
I shouldn't say Easter eggs, but like very, very, very
Commercialized.
veiled references to some things, or
Yeah.
like using tropes, let's say, from Disney movies,
Mhm. Yeah.
um, intentionally to tell a new story. So I'm kind of looking forward to just seeing how they do that. Yeah.
Well, thanks for joining me, Steve. This has been a blast.
Yeah.
It's always a blast to talk about Disney with you. I like to even just, text you or whatever and talk when something comes up and I'm like, oh, this is great because I know one person who
Yeah.
appreciates Disney as much as me. So thank you for
Oh
joining
man.
us.
It was a real pleasure. Thanks so much for having me, Ryan.
All right, and I'll think I'll be doing this maybe once a month if I could find a topic for each month. And yeah, thanks for joining us. And if you love Disney as much as I do, subscribe. And I will see you next time. This is Ryan Murphy, and thanks a lot.